A heavy silence lingered in the dimly lit room as the sound of the wind rattled the window panes. Julia sat alone at the kitchen table, nursing her glass of wine. Her husband, Robert, had left for his business trip that morning, and she found herself, as she often did, alone with her thoughts. But this time was different. It wasn't just loneliness that gnawed at her, it was the presence of someone else in the house. Her mother-in-law, Elise, had moved in temporarily, and though the idea had seemed innocent at first, Julia couldn't shake the tension that had grown between them in the past few weeks. It was nothing explicit, just a series of moments glances held too long, conversations that danced on the edge of intimacy, and the subtle but undeniable spark of something unspoken. The wine in Julia's glass swirled as she absent-mindedly moved her hand, her mind replaying the interaction she'd shared with Elise that day. There was nothing overt, but there was always something just beneath the surface. A gentle touch on her arm as Elise passed by, the way her eyes lingered a second too long when Julia spoke. It was maddening and intriguing all at once, leaving her conflicted and unsure of herself. The creak of the floorboards interrupted her thoughts, and Julia turned her head to see Elise standing in the doorway, dressed in a flowing silk robe that caught the soft light. Her expression was calm, but there was a softness in her eyes that Julia had noticed more frequently as of late. "You're still up." Elise's voice was low, intimate, as she stepped into the kitchen. Julia nodded, unable to find the right words. The air between them felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't quite name. She watched as Elise crossed the room and poured herself a glass of wine, the fluid grace of her movements drawing Julia's gaze. So they sat together in silence for a few moments, the quiet between them both comfortable and tense. Julia could feel the warmth radiating from Elise, their proximity sending a flutter through her chest. She tried to focus on the wine, on anything but the magnetic pull she felt toward the older woman sitting beside her. "Are you all right?" Elise asked softly, her hand reaching out to touch Julia's arm, her fingers brushing lightly over her skin. Julia's breath caught in her throat. The touch was so small, so seemingly insignificant, yet it sent a shiver down her spine. She turned her head to meet Elise's gaze, and in that moment, everything shifted. The boundaries they had carefully maintained seemed to blur, and Julia could see the same mix of uncertainty and desire reflected in Elise's eyes. I don't know," Julia whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her unspoken thoughts. She wasn't sure what she was admitting, or even if she wanted to. Elise's fingers lingered on her arm, her touch gentle but purposeful. "It's all right to be unsure," she said quietly, her voice a soothing balm to the storm of emotions raging inside Julia. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The tension between them crackled like static in the air, and Julia's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to say something, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself leaning into Elise's touch, the warmth of her hand grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. "Julia," Elise's voice was barely a whisper now, her fingers tracing delicate patterns along Julia's arm. There was a softness in her gaze, a tenderness that made Julia's chest tighten with longing. "I don't know what's happening," Julia confessed, her voice barely audible as she turned to face Elise fully. Elise's hand moved from Julia's arm to her cheek, her thumb gently brushing across her skin. "Neither do I," she admitted, her voice full of the same uncertainty and desire that Julia felt. "But I know that I can't stop thinking about you." The admission hung between them, raw and honest, and Julia felt her heart rocketing spots. The room seemed to close in around them, the world outside fading away until it was just the two of them, caught in a moment that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Without thinking, Julia leaned forward, her lips brushing softly against Elise's in a tentative, almost hesitant kiss. The contact was brief, just a whisper of a touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her entire body. Elise didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the kiss, her hand cupping the back of Julia's neck as she deepened the connection between them. The kiss was slow, exploratory, filled with the unspoken tension that had been building between them for weeks. Julia's hands found their way to Elise's waist, her fingers trembling as they gripped the fabric of her robe. The warmth of Elise's body pressed against hers was intoxicating, and she found herself lost in the sensation in the way Elise's lips moved against her own with a tenderness that took her breath away. They pulled apart only when the need for air became too much, their foreheads resting against each other as they caught their breath. Julia's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "Are we?" Julia's voice trailed off, unsure of what to say, unsure of what this meant. Elise's fingers gently stroked the back of her neck, her touch calming the storm inside her. "I don't know," Elise whispered, her breath warm against Julia's skin. "But whatever this is, I don't want it to stop." The words sent a shiver down Julia's spine, and she nodded, unable to deny the truth in them. Whatever this was, whatever line they had just crossed, she didn't want to go back. Julia swallowed hard, the weight of Elise's words settling over her like a thick blanket. She knew they had stepped into dangerous territory, but she couldn't bring herself to pull away. The warmth of Elise's breath on her skin, the soft pressure of her body so close it felt too right, too intoxicating to resist. Elise's fingers lingered at the nape of her neck, her touch soft yet firm, as if grounding them both in the reality of the moment. Her thumb gently brushed against Julia's jawline, a touch so intimate that it made Julia's heart flutter uncontrollably. There was no rush, no urgency, just the two of them, caught in a moment that felt both delicate and profound. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Julia whispered, her voice trembling. The thought of Robert flashed in her mind, bringing with it a pang of guilt. But even that was overshadowed by the sheer intensity of what she felt in Elise's presence. Elise closed her eyes for a moment, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "Neither do I," she said, her voice low, filled with the same internal conflict that weighed on Julia. "But sometimes feelings happen even when we don't expect them." There was a quiet, shared understanding between them, a mutual recognition that this wasn't supposed to happen, that it was complicated and messy. And yet, in the stillness of the kitchen, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Julia leaned in again, her lips finding Elise's in a slow, languid kiss. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Her hands moved of their own accord, slipping under the fabric of Elise's robe, the silk smooth and cool against her fingertips. She could feel the heat of Elise's skin beneath the material, the softness of her curves as she pressed closer. Elise's breath hitched as Julia's hands explored the length of her back, her fingers trailing over every dip and rise of her body. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more insistent, as if they were both trying to hold on to this moment before reality could catch up to them. Julia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind spinning as she lost herself in the feel of Elise's body, in the taste of her lips, in the quiet hum of desire that thrummed between them. It was overwhelming, the intensity of it all so much more than she had ever imagined. The line they had crossed felt like it was dissolving beneath them, blurring into something they couldn't control. Elise's hands were gentle but purposeful as they found their way to Julia's waist, pulling her closer until their bodies were pressed tightly together. The softness of Elise's robe brushed against Julia's skin, heightening the sensation of every touch, every movement. For a long moment, it was just the two of them, nothing else mattered. Julia's fingers slid further down, tracing the curve of Elise's hips, savoring the way her body responded to every touch. Elise let out a soft sigh, her breath warm and shallow as she rested her forehead against Julia's. "We shouldn't," Julia whispered, even as her body betrayed her words, her hands still exploring, still wanting. "I know," Elise murmured, her lips brushing against Julia's ear, sending a shiver down her spine. "But I can't stop." Neither of them could. Julia's pulse quickened as Elise's words sank in, resonating with a truth that was undeniable. They were teetering on the edge of something that neither of them fully understood, but neither could resist. The tension that had been building between them for weeks finally found its release, and the room seemed to grow smaller, more intimate, as they lost themselves in each other. Elise's hands roamed up Julia's back, her fingers tangling in the loose strands of her hair, pulling her closer until their lips met again, this time with a deep, hungry urgency. The kiss was electric, sending shockwaves of desire through Julia's body, and she found herself responding in ways she hadn't anticipated, her hands clutching at Elise's waist, pulling her in tighter, needing to feel her completely. They stumbled backward, almost as if the weight of their emotions was too much to bear, until Julia's back pressed against the cool surface of the kitchen counter. Elise's body pressed firmly against hers, the silk of her robe a whisper against Julia's skin, heightening every sensation. Julia's breath came in short gasps as Elise kissed her with a fervor that left her trembling, her mind spinning in a haze of passion and confusion. Elise, Julia breathed, her voice barely a whisper between kisses as she struggled to keep hold of her senses. "What are we doing?" Elise's lips hovered over hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. Her eyes were dark, filled with desire and something else, something deeper, more complex. "I don't know," she admitted softly, her voice husky with emotion. "But I can't stop." Neither could Julia. She leaned in, kissing Elise again, her hands slipping under the silk robe, her fingers exploring the soft, warm skin beneath. Elise let out a quiet gasp as Julia's hands moved up her sides, her touch both hesitant and bold, as if testing the boundaries of what they had just crossed. Time seemed to stand still, the world outside the kitchen fading away, until it was just them, wrapped in each other's arms, lost in a moment that felt like it had been inevitable all along. The sound of their breathing, shallow and quick, filled the room as their kisses deepened, their bodies pressing together with a heat that neither of them could deny. Julia's heart raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and desire. She had never felt anything like this before, the intensity of it almost too much to bear. Every touch, every kiss sent waves of heat coursing through her body, making her ache for more. And yet, beneath the physical desire, there was something else, a connection that went beyond mere attraction, something deeper and more dangerous. "Elise, we need to," Julia tried to speak, her words faltering as Elise's lips found the sensitive spot on her neck, sending a shiver of pleasure down her spine. "I know," Elise murmured, her voice a soft, breathless confession. "But I don't want to stop. Not yet." The weight of those words hung in the air between them, and Julia felt her resolve crumbling. She didn't want to stop either. Despite everything, the guilt, the fear, the knowledge that this was wrong, there was a part of her that wanted this, that needed this. The pull between them was too strong, too undeniable to resist any longer. Their movements became more urgent, their hands exploring each other's bodies with a growing sense of need. Julia's fingers slipped beneath the silk of Elise's robe, caressing the smooth skin of her back, while Elise's hands traced the curve of Julia's waist, pulling her even closer. The kitchen, the world, everything outside of this moment disappeared, leaving only them, tangled in each other's arms. "Elise," Julia whispered again, her voice trembling with emotion as she looked into Elise's eyes, searching for some kind of answer, some reassurance that they weren't making a terrible mistake. But all she found was the same longing, the same desire that she felt inside herself. Elise's gaze held Julia captive, her deep, steady eyes filled with something more than desire, something raw and unspoken. It was as if they were both standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing full well what lay below, but unable to stop themselves from jumping. The air between them was thick, charged with emotions they had tried for weeks to suppress but could no longer deny. Elise leaned in again, capturing Julia's lips with a tenderness that made Julia's heart ache. This kiss was different, slower, more deliberate, as if Elise was savoring every second of it. Her hands cupped Julia's face gently, the pads of her thumbs brushing softly over her cheeks, and Julia melted into the touch, feeling herself surrender completely to the moment. There was no going back now. As their kiss deepened, Elise's hands began to explore again, trailing down Julia's neck, her shoulders, the curve of her waist. Julia's skin tingled under her touch, each stroke sending a ripple of warmth through her. Her own hands mirrored Elise's movements, slipping beneath the soft fabric of her robe, discovering the delicate lines of her body with the same care and reverence. The world outside seemed to fade even further, until nothing else existed except the quiet sighs and soft gasps that filled the kitchen. Every kiss, every touch felt like a confession, a silent admission of the feelings they had both been too afraid to speak aloud. Julia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her pulse racing as she became more lost in Elise's embrace. "Elise," Julia whispered again, her voice barely audible as she pulled back just enough to meet Elise's gaze. Her hands rested on Elise's hips, holding her close, their bodies still pressed together in a way that felt both intoxicating and dangerous. "I don't know what we're doing, but I can't stop." Elise's eyes softened, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Neither can I," she admitted, her voice low and filled with emotion. "But maybe we don't need to figure it all out right now." Her words were a balm to Julia's conflicted thoughts. She didn't have the answers, neither of them did. But in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way Elise made her feel, the connection between them that was impossible to ignore. They kissed again, this time with a renewed sense of urgency. The intensity between them grew, their movements more desperate, as if they were both afraid of losing the moment. Julia's hands roamed Elise's body with more confidence now, her fingers tracing the smooth lines of her back, the soft curve of her hips, the delicate slope of her neck. Every touch seemed to heighten the tension between them, making her ache for more. "Elise," Julia's breath hitched as Elise's lips trailed down her jawline, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress tightly as she tried to hold on to what little control she had left. The sensations coursing through her body were overwhelming, clouding her mind, making it impossible to think clearly. She wanted Elise, but there was still that small voice in the back of her mind, reminding her of the consequences, of what would happen if they crossed the line completely. But Elise's touch made it hard to listen to that voice. She moved with such tenderness, such care, that it made Julia's heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just lust, it was something deeper, something more meaningful. It was as if Elise understood her, saw her in a way no one else ever had. And that thought alone made it impossible for Julia to pull away. Elise, Julia whispered again, her voice trembling as she tried to find the words. "This is..." "I know," Elise murmured, her lips brushing softly against Julia's ear. "But we can't go back now, can we?" Julia's breath caught in her throat as the truth of those words hit her. No, there was no going back. Not now. They had crossed the line. Whatever came next was inevitable. And in that moment, with Elise's body pressed against hers, with the feel of her lips and hands on her skin, Julia knew that she didn't want to go back. Not to the way things were before. With that realization, Julia let herself go completely. She gave in to the pull between them, to the overwhelming desire that had been building for weeks. Her hands slipped further under Elise's robe, her fingers tracing the curve of her spine, the softness of her skin sending shivers through her body. Elise responded in kind, her hands exploring every inch of Julia's body with the same hunger, the same need. Their kisses grew more frantic, their breathing more labored, as they moved together, caught in the heat of the moment. Clothes were discarded in a blur, their bodies finding each other again with a newfound intensity. The feel of Elise's skin against her own was almost too much, and Julia let out a soft moan as their bodies pressed together, fitting perfectly in a way that felt both familiar and new. They moved in unison, each touch, each kiss igniting a fire that burned hotter with every passing second. Julia's hands gripped Elise's hips tightly as they came together, their bodies entwined in a way that felt both passionate and tender. Every touch was filled with meaning, every kiss a promise of something deeper. Time seemed to lose all meaning as they made love, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring every second. Julia's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, desire, confusion, guilt, but in that moment, all of it seemed to fade away, leaving only the connection she felt with Elise, the way their bodies fit together, the way her heart raced with every kiss, every touch. When they finally collapsed into each other's arms, their bodies spent, their breathing heavy, Julia felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over her. The guilt, the confusion, it was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind. But for now, all that mattered was the warmth of Elise's body against hers, the quiet intimacy they had shared, the unspoken understanding between them. They lay there in the dim light of the kitchen, tangled in each other's arms, neither of them speaking. There was nothing to say, nothing that could possibly explain what had just happened. But as Julia rested her head against Elise's chest, listening to the steady beat of her heart, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. As they lay together, the quiet hum of the night enveloping them, Julia's mind raced with everything that had just transpired. The intensity of their connection still lingered in the air, a palpable force between them. Elise's hand absently traced circles on Julia's back, her touch gentle, soothing, but there was no denying the weight of what they had done. The reality of their situation crept back in, slow but unrelenting. The forbidden nature of their bond hovered like a shadow in the dim light of the kitchen. Julia pulled away slightly, just enough to look up at Elise. Her eyes were soft but conflicted, mirroring the same confusion that swirled in Julia's chest. Elise, Julia's voice broke the silence, her words barely a whisper. "What happens now?" Elise didn't answer right away. She stared at the ceiling for a moment, as if searching for clarity in the stillness of the night. Her lips parted, and she exhaled softly before meeting Julia's gaze, her fingers still gently caressing her back. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice low, filled with an aching vulnerability. "I never thought this would happen." Julia swallowed, her heart pounding as the enormity of their situation settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had crossed a line with Elise, a line she never thought she would even approach, much less leap across. Her mind screamed at her to think about Robert, about the consequences, but the pull she felt toward Elise, this deep, undeniable connection blurred the edges of reason. They lay in silence for a while, the weight of their thoughts pressing down on them both. Julia couldn't help but feel the pang of guilt gnawing at her, the knowledge that this wasn't just about them. There were others involved: Robert, her marriage, the life she had built. And yet, lying in Elise's arms, she couldn't deny the depth of the feelings that had taken root between them. "I don't regret it," Elise finally said, her voice soft but firm. "Whatever this is, whatever it means, I don't regret it." Julia's breath caught in her throat at the honesty in Elise's words. She felt the same. Despite the guilt, despite the fear of what might come next, there was a part of her that didn't regret it either. How could she, when the connection between them had felt so real, so undeniable? "I don't either," Julia whispered, her voice trembling. "But I don't know what to do." Elise's hand stilled on Julia's back, her gaze softening as she reached up to brush a strand of hair from Julia's face. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," she said gently. "We've already crossed the line. Maybe we just need to take things one step at a time." Her words were a balm to Julia's conflicted thoughts. She nodded slowly, leaning into Elise's touch, letting the comfort of her presence wash over her. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead was fraught with complications, but for now, they had this moment. And perhaps, that was enough. They stayed like that for a long time, tangled together in the quiet darkness of the kitchen, their breathing slow and steady. The intensity of the night had softened, leaving only the quiet intimacy between them, a bond that neither of them could explain, but both felt deeply. Eventually, the exhaustion of the night began to settle in, and Julia felt her eyelids grow heavy. Elise's arms wrapped around her more tightly, pulling her close as they drifted off into a light, restless sleep, the weight of their unspoken emotions hanging over them like a cloud. When morning came, the soft light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a pale glow over the kitchen. Julia stirred first, the events of the night before crashing back into her consciousness like a tidal wave. Her heart raced as she realized where she was, her body still pressed against Elise's, their limbs tangled together in the aftermath of what they had shared. She carefully untangled herself, trying not to disturb Elise, who was still fast asleep. As she stood up, the cool morning air hit her skin, bringing with it a sobering clarity. The guilt that had been lingering in the background surged to the forefront, and Julia felt her stomach twist with the realization of what they had done. What now? How could she possibly go back to her normal life after this? How could she face Robert, knowing what had happened between her and his mother? Julia quickly dressed, her hands trembling as she buttoned her shirt. She glanced back at Elise, who had begun to stir, her eyes fluttering open as she stretched languidly on the kitchen floor. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Julia saw the same conflicted emotions reflected in Elise's gaze. Julia, Elise started, her voice thick with sleep, but Julia shook her head. "I need some time," Julia whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need to figure out what all of this means." Elise sat up, her expression soft but understanding. "I know, I do too." There was no grand resolution, no clear path forward. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the weight of that reality hung heavy in the air between them. Julia gave Elise one last lingering look before she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her heart heavy with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. As she stepped outside into the crisp morning air, Julia felt the first rays of sunlight warm her skin. The world around her was unchanged, but she knew that everything inside her had shifted. She wasn't sure what the future held for her, for Elise, for her marriage, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't ignore the truth of what had happened between them. It was messy, it was complicated, and it was wrong in so many ways. But it was also real. And that, more than anything, was what scared her the most.